what is the thesis process? Last semester, these students did research. They wrote documents, they visited sites, they looked at precedents and examples that would inform their thinking. They put together a series of chapters on each of those topics, site analysis, program analysis, etc. This semester, of course, they spent all their time designing, and then at 11:59, they go back and they kind of clean up all their pro-thesis work and put it into some sort of nice package so that they can, in fact, inform you about their thought process. So it's essentially a one-year exploration, but the actual design is really just one semester. So the production, of course, is geared that way. Now we're going to go over on the other side of the world to Jakarta, and we're going to look at a place that many of you have probably read about, this whole decision about whether to save Jakarta or move the capital, etc., and what we're going to do about climate change and the rise of sea level, etc., etc. So Lauren's going to take us there, and thank you.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Lauren. My thesis today looks at coastal cities against the threat of sea level rise. But before I begin, I want to thank my fantastic professors, Professor Ronnie Eisenbach and Marcus Hendricks here, for helping me through this process. My family and friends who provided a lot of support for me, as well as David M. Schwartz Architects, who gave me the opportunity to travel abroad for my
I want to interrupt for
research.
1 second. Lauren is a dual degree candidate. She's getting a dual degree in architecture and planning.
Okay, Jakarta underwater, rising seas as opportunity. Today I want to talk about a statistic that I read in a UN report that said that in the next 75 years, 5.25 billion people will live in coastal cities. And this won't be uniform across the globe, actually. So today our largest cities are New York, Mexico City, Manila, Tokyo, Jakarta, etc. But this global shift and boom in urban population will actually occur in the global south. So as you can see in these diagrams, as I move from 2050 to 2075 to 2100, you can see that our coastal cities are actually going to grow tremendously over the next 75 years, specifically in the global south, where infrastructure has not kept pace with rapid urbanization. This is true for a lot of cities, Lagos, Manila, etc., where population is going to grow tremendously, especially in cities like Lagos that are expected to reach 88 million people, which is about 10 times the population of New York City. So this is going to be a really big topic over the next 75 years as we balance population growth with the threat of climate change, specifically sea level rise in coastal cities. So like I said, this growth is going to occur in Asia and Africa, primarily in developing cities where infrastructure has not kept pace with this urbanization. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of why this is the topic we should be talking about, 1 in 4 people in cities live in sunlight conditions globally. 9 in 10 people in cities breathe polluted air. Only 38% of cities treat their wastewater. 50% don't have access to waste collection, and 785 million people globally lack access to clean drinking water. And this is true for Jakarta, Indonesia, and I'm going to go into some of these challenges. But before I do that, I want to take you all on a trip to Jakarta and talk to you a little bit about my research and what I observed while I was there. So Jakarta is the capital city of Indonesia. It's in the Pacific and Indian Ocean. It exists on the Java island of the entire archipelago. Jakarta is a population of about 30.8 million people in its metropolitan city. It's of course the capital, and it's the most populated city in And it has this really rich and interesting history. It's been settled for a long time. It was originally settled as a port city and has undergone many influences, including colonization from the Dutch, occupation from the Japanese during World War II, and finally gained independence in 1950. And it has this really rich maritime culture that began many, many years ago and still exists today. It was a really important stop along maritime Silk Road trade routes and the Dutch East Indies trade routes, and it was primarily a city that traded cloves, cinnamon, coffee, etc., and fish too. And today you can really, while you're walking through the city, you can really understand and see all the influences that the city has experienced over time. And it's a really rich culture of different demographics and economies. You can see the old Dutch architecture. You can experience the maritime culture there. You can see some of the ancient mangroves. It's a really interesting and beautiful city. And Jakarta today is still a really important stop in trade routes. Jakarta is the one city in Indonesia that still serves as its export port. So all of the goods and services that are exported from the city come to Jakarta and then are distributed throughout the world. So it's still a really important economic city globally. Jakarta's main historic core, of course, was developed mostly during colonial rule, but its largest urbanization period actually began in 1970, and from 1970 till today, it's actually exploded and become an extremely urban, dense environment. And that rapid urbanization has led to some really big challenges that the city is facing today. So frequent and severe flood is a common problem. Every year the city floods. Some parts of the city flood almost every week. And the city has experienced frequent and severe flood more consistently and more frequently. There's a lot of failing flood infrastructure in the country, or in the city. It's mostly seawalls, trash piles, and sandbags that keep water out of inundated areas. There's very poor sanitation here, so the city doesn't have any formal waste system. And only 30% of residents don't have access to a toilet. So sanitation and pollution is a really big problem in this city. This extreme pollution has caused severe water insecurity. So even though there are 13 rivers that run through the city, every single one of them is very polluted and too polluted to drink from. So this water insecurity has left 5 million people in the city without access to water. Most water in the city is not piped from the city, it's actually pumped out of the ground. And the way these residents are getting water is by pumping it illegally, which is causing severe subsidence in Jakarta. So parts of Jakarta actually sink up to 25 centimeters a year. And you can really see this throughout the city. So these are all challenges that the city faces today that they'll have to deal with in the future. In addition, these are some of the observations and obstacles I experienced while traversing through the city. So sanitation problem is really apparent. There's a lot of physical and dangerous barriers that make it hard to walk by foot in the city. And you can really understand the poor housing conditions and the threat of flood when you're walking through. So compounding all of these challenges is the threat of sea level rise in the next 25 to 75 years. The dark blue areas here represent frequently flooded areas. This pink line represents projected flood by 2050. And the second one behind that is projected flood by 2100. So because Jakarta has experienced this sinking problem, about 40% of the city already exists below sea level. So even though sea level rise is a problem in the future, Jakarta is specifically at risk because any failure in its infrastructure can completely flood the city and totally cause a challenge here. But this isn't a problem specific to Jakarta. A lot of cities are going to be experiencing this threat in the future. Mumbai, Lagos, Shanghai, many cities are going to experience the threats of sea level rise in the coming 75 years. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of the subsidence problem in this city, these are some of the areas that I documented while I was there. Most places in the city are holding back water by sand piles or trash piles. So of course not a reliable flood infrastructure technique. There's a few pumping stations in the city. There's mostly seawalls along the north coast, and then a couple of bulkheads that bring you about 2 feet above the average sea level, but that of course doesn't block flood and sea level rise in the future. So we're going to have to rethink about how this city can protect itself in the future. So recently, Indonesia decided that it's going to actually move its capital from Jakarta to another island to escape these threats. And it's going to invest $26 billion into a brand new city on another island. However, this investment doesn't include the relocation of its residents. So 60% of the city that can barely afford food, water, and housing will be left to fend for themselves when the city ultimately moves. So we're going to have to think about how does the city transition in a period of challenges and severe threats. So today I want to talk about how this transition can, instead of being viewed as a threat, be turned into an opportunity and be used as a case study for how cities globally can deal with this problem. So just to cap, some of the issues that we're talking about here is consistent flooding and subsidence, which will ultimately cause increased flood severity and permanent sea level rise. But there are factors in between here that we can mitigate that ultimately could slow or halt these effects in the future. So unreliable infrastructure, poor access to drinking water, which is causing people to pump out of the ground, which is causing sinking, poor sanitation, rapid urbanization, and degraded ecosystem services can all be attacked as a problem to help slow this process or halt it altogether. So when we think about how a city can develop with these problems, we want to be asking, how can we protect the city in a period of transition? How to preserve the history and the culture of the city? How to improve access of people, goods, and services, especially in a city where it's really hard to get around like Jakarta? And how can we limit suffering? So something my thesis looks at is how can these threats be turned into an opportunity? So I want to talk about a couple of opportunities in Jakarta that we can capitalize on towards development. So, for example, the first opportunity that I want to talk about is traditional approaches to infrastructure. So we can implement infrastructure that not only protects, but harnesses energy from the water. So in Jakarta, water has always been seen as an asset. Why not use it here as an asset as well? So we can harness energy from water to create clean drinking water, which causes less subsidence and ultimately affects better health and better sanitation. That water and energy can actually be used to generate a profit, and that money can be used to maintain infrastructure. A secondary opportunity here is making use of inundation by using waterways for movement of people and goods. So there's already a maritime culture of the city, and people get around by boat, so why not take advantage of this opportunity? And it also relieves traffic congestion, which causes less carbon pollution. It makes a better city, so why not look at that as an opportunity? And then finally, active retreat from dangerous zones creates an opportunity to restore ecology. So mangroves, and there's already some in the city today, provide really important ecosystem services and reduce flood severity. And then of course, local fishermen, which is a huge economy here, can benefit from this development. So I want to revisit again a flood map of Jakarta versus sea level rise map. And I've looked at many scenarios about how Jakarta could develop in the future. But for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the one that I think is the most feasible.
You brought me water.
Oh, thank you. Okay, so this is my vision for the future of Jakarta by 2075. I'm going to walk you through how I got here. So I overlaid a map of common flood and sea level rise, and thought, okay, how can we adapt the city to take advantage of some of these areas? So the first move here would be to widen rivers upstream so that you can automatically alleviate the impacts of flood. Next, you can build infrastructure islands in areas that either should be protected, like historic areas, or areas that aren't commonly flooded. And then finally, when water inundates over the next 50 years, the city is protected. And the best part about this scheme is that it's adaptable over time. So these islands that we're creating here can be changed and adapted based on a changing future. And then finally, this scheme helps to double protection from flood, because when it exists in an island, if the infrastructure of one island fails, and infrastructure does fail, when infrastructure fails on this one island, it doesn't impact the rest of the city. Whereas something like an outer seawall dike, if it fails, it would totally flood the entire city. So this is an adaptable solution for the future. So these levees can be used to improve access to the waterfront and create an amenity for the city, and preserve the historic core. So how can we actually do this? What's going to be the technology that we can use to actually implement this future? And how can we turn this threat to an opportunity? So there are a lot of possibilities here to take advantage of energy from the water, to protect the city, and to provide clean drinking water to its citizens. And I'm proposing to use tidal energy, which can provide energy to produce water through a reverse osmosis system, which can be combined with a deployable flood barrier to change with adapting sea level. This reverse osmosis system is it's perfect solution for Jakarta because it's compact and adaptable and can produce a lot of water at once. So one 40-foot by 9-foot system can produce 105,000 gallons of water. It has a quick 4-year return on investment, and after that return on investment, a gallon of water can be sold for 0.007 cents, which is less than the average cost of water in the city. So not only can it be used to generate profit, but also provide cheaper water for the city too. So this reverse osmosis system would be powered by a turbine technology that actually makes use of subsidence and changing sea level to create water. So as water rises on one side, this turbine can be opened to produce energy with water coming through the other side and vice versa, so it can flush water in and out. So an opportunity for implementation, there's many opportunities around the city that can be used for implementation, but the best one for first deployment would be at Sunda Kelapa, which is the historic port in Jakarta. This is an aerial image of it right now. These 3 buildings are old Dutch colonial warehouses. They traded spices here. There's a fish market here. There's a fishing community on the left side here. And all of them work on the port side on the right. However, there's no connection between the two. So anybody that lives in this fishing community either has to come all the way out and around, or they have to hop on a boat over a seawall to get to the other side. This is an aerial view. So the concept behind my design here is that this building can serve as a bridge between the fishing community and their place of work. And these reverse osmosis modules can be multiplied across that canal with a distribution portion and a demonstration portion that bookend the reverse osmosis systems. So the way this building would work is there would be these turbines that exist in the water with deployable barriers in between that can move up and down with changing water levels. And above these are the reverse osmosis systems that are powered by that energy. And then a bridge, an exterior bridge and a service corridor bridge on top that bring these programs together. With this building and the way it's set up with a bridge between two, spanning the historic port of Sunda Kelapa, this building can now serve as a symbol, as a gateway to the city. So it exists on the historic core of the city. So when you're coming down the canal, you can pass underneath this building in times where there isn't flood. That barrier can come down, boats can pass through, and you're passing through this gateway into the historic core of the city. So first floor plan here, the building opens up to a public space and an amphitheater where visitors can come into the building, come into this demonstration space, cross a bridge to go over to their place of work, or they can go upstairs and observe the reverse osmosis systems, and then end in the control room and the distribution center on the other side of the building. This is a view of that demonstration space. This is where people could come to learn about the process of by which water is produced here, can learn about waste and sanitation in the city, and also opens up and looks at this beautiful view of the harbor and celebrates that history of maritime culture in the city. This is a section through one of those modules, through the turbine and the reverse osmosis system. So as water rises on one side, those deployable barriers can come up, and the turbine regulates how much water can come in and out of the city and produces enough energy for 150,000 homes. That water, or that energy, can be used to produce energy, to produce the drinkable water, which is then distributed in the service corridor on either sides of the building. So the structure is extremely simple. So the base is a concrete base, and then everything above it is polycarbonate panels and kayu kelapa coconut wood, which is sourced from Indonesia. It has this really beautiful, fantastic grain on it and is used in traditional Indonesian architecture, so it really calls to traditional architecture and kind of identifies it's used in traditional Indonesian architecture and beckons back to the history of building and wood architecture in this city and country. So this is a repeatable scheme. It can be repeated across the city to provide those 5 million people that don't have access to water with now water stations. So one of these buildings can produce almost 1 million gallons of water a day. That's enough to service 60,000 people in 1 square mile. Again, it powers 150,000 homes. And while 40 stations seems like a lot, it actually produces less dependence on infrastructure, because right now this city depends on 71 pumping stations and 159 flood barriers. So this building isn't only an infrastructure building, it can now be used to make place. So the building sits again along the canal here and can open up onto 2 public spaces on either ends of the bridge. So the demonstration space side opens up onto a community, and the opposite side opens up onto an existing mosque and can service the people that work in the port. Water distribution in the city is a really important topic because there is very little piped infrastructure for water, so water is distributed mostly informally by people in carts with these water tanks. So why not take advantage of that and really provide more economic opportunity by creating more jobs for water distribution like this. So this is a view looking from the public space on this side to the water tower, where people can come fill up their water tanks. And then on the opposite side, boats and trucks can fill up their water in the distribution center. And then finally, water can also be distributed by trucks that can pick up and drop off tanks. So because this water now exists in this community, it can actually support other functions. So with the availability of this clean drinking water, why not also provide a bathhouse for people that don't have access to a toilet? So my proposal here is to build this water plant that can then service a community and a public bathhouse so that people have access to toilets, they have access to showers, and that now creates a community space where this building now enforces or reinforces an existing community. So the challenges of water supply and cleanliness make simple everyday tasks really challenging in Jakarta. And $6.3 billion was spent last year from the Indonesian government to deal with the impacts of poor sanitation. So why not use this building as an opportunity to provide these services? So my proposal is a community bathhouse, one for men, one for women, that can provide a variety of different spaces. So a community space, laundry is now an option here, a clinic where a traveling doctor could come administer vaccines, a prayer room, individual bathing rooms, an infant room and a nursing room, and then an exterior courtyard that creates a protected space for this program. And then finally, upstairs, flexible classroom and daycare spaces. This is a view from that protected courtyard with the individual bathing rooms behind these boxes. And a view from the inside. So this is a section through the site that explains how water is used here. So water is generated and pumped to either the distribution center or the water tank here. This water tank services the bathhouses that come down the site into their own gray water and freshwater tanks. Those tanks service the bathhouse, and then any wastewater is then funneled into an anaerobic baffled reactor, which cleans the water. That gray water is then released into another natural filtration system and then can be used for gray water for toilets. And this scheme is not only repeatable, but can be adapted to different conditions in the city. So where there are neighborhoods that maybe don't have as much space, or maybe canals aren't wide enough for the larger turbine system, there are other options for adapting this scheme to different conditions in the city. And to finally talk about towards resiliency in Jakarta. So as the city transitions and people have to move or actively retreat from dangerous areas, we're going to have to think about how these communities can resettle elsewhere in better conditions. So for example, if the site is here, The community that lives in this area can actively retreat and resettle here. Here's a figure ground. That area is right here. These are some of the housing conditions of that neighborhood. And something that I would really like to point out is that these neighborhoods are so packed and condensed that that air and sunshine can't get into these houses. So the typology here So the housing typology here is a block of homes is sort of like a shotgun style, but one family per room. And most of these alleys are about 8 feet wide. So it's really hard to get air and sunshine into these spaces. So my proposal makes a slight modification to that typology. By introducing courtyards in this typology. So the way this would work is that families can get a 2-room unit that can then grow and adapt over time. But the important part here is that trucks can get in and out with a 9-foot driving corridor so that they can service the showers and toilets here. So in conclusion, this project attacks the need to protect a city, preserve its heritage and history, produces energy and water in a city that really needs it, improves movement, provides a strategy for localized retreat, and improves living standards. And finally, proposes a solution that is practical and sustainable to promote healthy and dignified living with spaces between them that encourage community vitality. Thank you.
Where's that mic?
No mic? Yeah, wow. So I don't usually just like to gush on a project, but I just have to start with that because it cannot be left unsaid. Like, this is a thesis, and this, like, the level of thought and the kind of importance of the thought and the way that you carried it out, from strategy to thinking to detail to execution across every scale, is incredible. And every time I thought you'd be done, you added something else that I would have said, that I could have said, hey, did you think about this? Like the bathhouses, and then the housing, and then, oh, by the way, I took this thing and I moved it over here and made it a little bit smaller, and like, wow, I'm impressed. I literally feel a little jealous of your thesis.
I agree. It's kind of mind-blowing how you've gone at all these different scales. It's also mind-blowing to look at these islands of cities and wonder what they'll be like. But that's not really the part of what we're here today to talk about. Is the housing plan that you showed at the end here? Or
No, it's only, yeah. I'll just get back here. Yeah, the units are up there.
Right. I mean, this was just the final grace note that you even got down to this. And so I really just have questions at this point. The turbine technology exists?
Does exist, yeah.
And the economics of it? Have you had a chance to?
That's a little unclear. Yeah, it only exists in one city in Swansea Bay, England, and it's pretty new. So, we'll see how it goes in the future. But tidal energy itself as a concept is used everywhere. So this is an interesting way to take advantage of not only changing sea and flood, but also the subsidence issue, where there's already a great change in water. So.
I'm going to pass this on. I'm full of questions about, well, when the government leaves, is there any work left for people now that they have clean water?
Yeah, I try.
There's some planning issues here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it was hard to find how many people are actually employed by the city. But like I said, 60% of the city is living in slums. So it's likely that at least 50% of the city will still remain. So.
Yeah, I mean, visually it's extremely clear and consistent and a beautiful presentation, like graphically beautiful presentation. Your drawings read really well. I appreciate that there's some hand stuff in there as well that are just simple and basic to show the ideas. The one tiny little bit of critique I would offer is just thinking about the aesthetic from this perspective of the historic district, and if that is kind of a main one or a primary entrance for as a first one, does that have a more a bigger expression for it, or is it truly that these are just adaptable and they're the same thing everywhere plunked around? That'd be the only thing I would ask.
Yeah, and I think that's a question I've definitely wrestled with throughout the semester is this should be something that's really affordable? Should it be something that's a little bit more aesthetic? And I mean, aesthetic and affordable can be the same, but you know what I mean. You know, what should this thing look like, but how can it also be adapted over time?
So I also am struck by the scope of what you've addressed, both the scientific aspect, the urban planning aspect. I particularly am interested in the housing aspect. I appreciated that you provided improvements for the residents who are being displaced. That's always a concern when you try to improve something in an urban setting. You end up affecting the people who live there. So you've given them opportunities as well. It's a little depressing, though, that the issues that we're dealing with here are the same issues: access to light and air, overcrowding, sanitation. Those are the same photographs that were done 100 years ago by Jacob Riis in the U.S. So in a way, nothing has changed, even though we've thought about a lot of these things. But it's great that you're addressing them comprehensively and providing a solution.
Yeah, and just to add to that, what has been really interesting to me is that we have solutions, tons of solutions for sea level rise and other problems like this, but Jakarta and developing cities, those aren't necessarily appropriate or feasible here. So that was the added challenge of this project, is what can actually work in Jakarta.
So I would echo the praise that's gone around. I think from the global perspective down to the actual local and livability, nailed it. So congratulations on that. Very wide-ranging, and maybe my one thing that I focused on, probably because I threw out my back this weekend, was the one thing I still see is people carting around the water jugs, and I think, well, okay, if we're putting in all this infrastructure, are not some pipes, a way to manage some of that? Because I think about people aging and being able to manage water in that way, and carrying around, I don't know how much those jugs weigh. But,
Yeah.
I think that would be an issue. But beyond, you can address that if you want to, but beyond that, I would just say that I love how your perspective renderings, even though they're computer generated, really feel like they're occupied spaces that look realistic to place, look livable, look, I can believe that they are implementable, and they really show your deep understanding of how people live here and what the challenges that they're striving through, and maybe how we can help to improve them with very logical solutions that you would hope would be implementable. But yeah, I mean, you can address the water jug. I'm sure you have an answer for that.
So like I said, so water in Jakarta is privatized. There's no municipal service, or well, there is a municipal service, but it only serves about 3% of the city. So the idea is that this building could be implemented today and work within an existing system. But of course, over time, it would be ideal if a pipe system could be hooked up to this building and the others that could be multiplied across the city, and then, of course, better distribute water throughout the city.
That's funny, I was just thinking of it as sort of like, each one of these are like a little franchise in a sense, that can expand and contract depending on the actual location and the width of the canal or space. So it's really good that you come up with a prototype that can be adapted depending on where it's located on your islands. So it's pretty good to see that.
Thank you.
You really demonstrated your double major with this project. It's really good demonstration of both major, architecture and regional and city planning. So I applaud you for that.
Thank you.
Very nice. Very good presentation. I don't have much more to add, with the exception that one of the diagrams or the analysis that I would have liked to have seen, and you probably have it, is identifying, you made it clear that 60% of the population is impoverished.
Yeah.
Where's the 40%? Where is the 60%? Where are these pockets of people? Are they dispersed? Are they collected? How is this segregated city portrayed in an analysis? And that would have been helpful to see how to attack that. And that's especially important with this idea of equity and trying to resolve these environmental justice issues.
Yeah.
Right? Because I suspect that, and I hope not, but I suspect that many of these interventions might be happening in areas that the wealthy might live, or the corporate sector might live, that kind of thing. We certainly would not want that to be.
Yeah, it's really interesting actually. This reservoir that you see here, half of it is a slum and the other half are mansions. And the mansion side has infrastructure protecting it against the city, the other half has nothing. So that really demonstrates the injustice in the city.
I suspect you picked the place and then found the problem.
Other way around.
Other way around, interesting. So this is what you were interested in doing, and then you found the right place where you felt that this was,
Yeah.
oh, that's interesting. I think you should package this up and send it to the mayor of Venice as soon as possible. Given the problems that place is having, they do have a very large project to control water going into the lagoon. It's unclear whether it's going to work. Yours seems like a scale, and that's an enormous thing that they're putting at the entrance to the lagoons, and I don't think they've started building it yet, but clearly they have similar issues. I mean, it's interesting you say that, because I mean, I think one of the nice lessons of this project is the sort of way in which a thesis evolves. I mean, the thesis idea, and then trying to find, and by the way, it's a beautiful project.
Thank you.
But one of the interesting things about the thesis process is that those intersections that happen along the way between what you're interested in and what the place demands of you. It tends to exist whether you're interested in it or not. I mean, the problems of Jakarta are there whether you do a thesis project or not. But what's nice is, I think, in the project is the fact that not only is the problem, a global problem addressed, but also brought to a kind of very clear synthesis of what it means to this particular place. It also makes me think that architects used to be much more engaged in problems of civic infrastructure. And it could well be that some of the imperatives today with climate change may in fact force us to become more engaged with those things. It used to be that architects built power plants and built beautiful roads and things like that. And we did a pretty good job after World War II, because of the way the sort of scale of the world economy evolved, of consigning that to engineering and specialists and things like that. And what I think your project does very nicely is it shows that you could actually intersect very important technological invention with placemaking and the architecture of the place. And it could well be that maybe one of the things we ought to do here in Maryland or other places as well is have a studio dedicated to architecture and infrastructure, try and find these problems where we can actually be much instead of worrying about some house that some Black Cape architect did that's of a shape humanity has never seen before, really get into these kinds of places, you know, like go to Annapolis and go to the Eastern Shore, go to these places that are going to impact it, and try and understand the problem in such a way that we can bring this kind of thinking to those places, because we used to do it very, very well. I mean, while you were talking, I was reminded of this beautiful bridge project that Plutchnik did in Ljubljana, the Three Bridges thing, which was absolutely, or he also did a sluiceway too, he did a flood control thing too, as well. He did all these things, because that's what architects did in those days. They sort of understood civic works and public works, and it was all part of the sort of portfolio of what you were supposed to do in the public realm. And I think your project is a very nice jumping off point for that, because in the hands of an engineer, I'm not trashing engineering is important, but in the hands of an engineer, it would be missing all these other components. You know, the placemaking, the business of understanding the cultural life, understanding the whole way in which people get to work, and crossing this and crossing that. It would have missed all that. It probably might have solved certain technical requirements, you know, but it probably would have missed a lot of other stuff, which I think is really one of the great lessons of what you've done.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I was originally interested in coastal cities because I was interested in the infrastructure piece. And the water and energy and sanitation part didn't come into play until I learned about the other challenges in Jakarta that you need to deal with to even start talking about infrastructure. So this project has kind of evolved into something that tries to tackle other issues.
Just a follow-up question of interest. What happens with the submerged cities? I mean, I feel like there could be a whole industry built on going and exploring those, but
more archaeologists.
Right, yeah, exactly. But are some of those materials reclaimed? What happens with areas? I mean, there's some nice city grids that are now underwater, but there's a lot of built material too. What happens? With that?
And to add to that, my project has sort of been about like, is it feasible to save the entire city? Is it like, should we just draw the line at 2100 flood level and that's where we're going to stop and everybody else has to retreat? Is that feasible? That brings up other problems of, if the entire city is flooded, it's not just now all water, it's now buildings and water. So what's the right balance of reclaim, protect, and let go? So.
It's really too bad the government isn't just going to build new government center on higher ground. But the drawing you're standing in front of that shows the 40 stations reminds me so much of Washington's metro system. Because when I look at the actual specific architecture of your stations, it's very nice. It's a little generic. That's okay. It looks very affordable, which is fabulous. But if that gets replicated all across the city like this, is that a good thing, or should they be different? And I think about what is so wonderful about our metro system, which is below grade, but it creates an architecture that visually in people's heads ties our city together. So this just raises a really interesting question. Is it designed by one architectural firm as a kit of parts to be used everywhere, or is each station farmed out to different architectural firms? Is it localized in the historic district or not? And those are really wonderful questions to be able to think about as you solve the flooding and seawater runoff.
Yeah, I had a similar question just about, I actually think that this one example looks like something that could exist there. There's like using the wood and the kind of form of it and the way that you're making windows, surfaces, and things. Like you showed a couple of images, like the image up there. I think that next part of it for me would be wanting, similar to some of the past conversations, it's like wanting to understand really how this thing fits into the kind of architectural strategy, like materials and color. There was a beautiful kind of waterfront building that was kind of blue and gold that was on there, and like I could imagine, it actually formally was very similar, but it was a lot more colorful. So I could imagine, that being another, the next step is like you've got all the pieces and you've kind of solved the planning strategies and the scale and the program. The next thing is like, how could you push it? And again, is it a prototype that's replicated ad nauseum, or does it get redesigned using the same kit of parts but in a kind of different way each time, depending on the neighborhood?
Yeah, I think it should definitely be able to be adapted, and community should be able to have some influence over what this looks like and how it plugs into an existing urban fabric. My goal here was, to propose something that is simple and affordable and realistic. And if for some reason there was an opportunity to improve it or do something bigger and grander, of course that would be great. But after going there and talking to planners and talking to the engineers that are working on this problem there, they all said that no matter what solution they came up with, it was always a challenge to produce something that was actually feasible within like a time frame that would actually work in Jakarta. So my goal was to design something that could be implemented immediately and affordably. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mel Thompson. I'm a principal at Women Parker, and Lauren's been a student of ours since she started here at Merritt, and she is a rock star. We're very, very proud of you at Women Parker. We can't wait to get you in our office in January. From all of us.
Thank you, Mel.
From all of us to you.
Thank you, Mel.
Good job.
Can I give you a hug?
Marcus and I co-led this, since Lauren is a dual degree student. So Marcus, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I just want to say how grateful I am to have had the opportunity to serve on Lauren's committee. This has been a pleasure, and her ability to really demonstrate effectively, the skills that she's gained through both architecture and planning. She did a remarkable job. I also appreciate sort of just how she took us through some of these global environmental problems, potential solutions, but also sort of took it down to a hyper-local level in terms of what's the reality of these things actually being, and possibility of these things being implemented. Because we had discussions that even within Jakarta and the local area, from block to block, island to island, community to community, the dynamics could change, right? And being sensitive to those changes is incredibly important in terms of sort of sustainable transitions, in terms of the communities taking ownership, seeing a place for themselves in terms of this, technological infrastructural transition. And I really appreciate it, and sort of being able to integrate the equity and justice lens from the very beginning, right? Not waiting to the end and thinking about it, but starting to think about it and implement it from the very beginning is something that sort of I lean on quite often in the class that Lauren took with me, as well as other classes. And the last final thing that I would say is just sort of a call to act. I appreciate the call to action in terms of architects and planners reclaiming a stake in infrastructure design, planning, and management is absolutely critical, and it will become increasingly critical as we deal with some of these global challenges. So thank you, Lauren, for allowing me to be a part of this.
Thank you.
So I want to start with your first question, which is, why is this a topic we should be talking about? And I think that's such an important question for all of us to think about how we use our talents and our energy, because we're fortunate enough to have some choices. And so the fact that you started with that question, what is important for me to be thinking about today, is so, at every level, is so critical. And Lauren and I talked a lot about the way in which we ask questions and how we frame questions. And in the framing of the question and the rethinking of questions leads us to a whole different set of possibilities. We looked at the Rapido Housing Project, which is an idea about incremental change and rethinking of what happens, knowing places are going to flood. So there are a few things that I'd like to say of my appreciation for this project. First of all is that you did start with a question and something you were interested in, and then looked for the place for that. And you started with this thread of water, and her first image in the thesis, we have a meeting at the beginning of the year where everybody has a board, was stunning. She showed it. Can you actually click to that?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, it's the same. Go back. Yeah, that one.
This image, for me, asked the question in a different way. I think there was another part of it. Because there was, on one hand, the showing that the city was being built upon constantly. And there was also the question, though, about that the idea, I've only thought about the flooding in the past, but that the water coming in provided energy. That actually could be a source of an economic engine. And it flipped it totally. And we had an incredible conversation from that because I had only ever seen it as threat. And I think it was that thread and sort of pulling the thread of the water all the way down to the issue of sanitation and drinking water, how it affected the land and the culture. Another piece of our conversation, and as we read the news all the time, was why save this place? How do we argue for the saving of these different places, of these investments? And there was just an article about the Florida Keys recently, where the government in that area decided they couldn't afford it. And so Lauren dug deeply then into what's unique about this culture. As humans, we've created all these rich cultures around the world. And so working to try to understand and build upon the assets and particularity of that culture in your choices, I think was also really key. Lauren had the amazing opportunity to visit Indonesia, but also Denmark and also Japan, looking at how different cultures had dealt with the water. And when she came back from Indonesia, and you'll pardon me for sharing this, her face was all broken out. She looked really sick. She was physically sick.
Had a respiratory infection.
She had a respiratory infection. So she had this incredible opportunity to put her body in that place. And we talked about holding that. How, that she had a memory and experience in her body as a visitor she could leave, but that was such valuable information. And she's healthy now because she gets to live here. But I think that physical experience, the smells, but then also the wonder of the culture and the people and the food and the other, the buildings also were part and parcel in this. We also, and forgive me for this long thing, I think the conversation Paul Dupuy and Marcus and I had with Lauren was also thinking about this idea. In the middle of her project, she found that Jakarta, that the mayor had decided to move it. That wasn't part of the plan, right? And so it also was a really key thing in the idea about how do you build in flexibility, adaptability? How do you think about time and how something changes and it's something in transition? And I would really want to applaud you for taking that on, showing us how this could be implemented over time, what was going to happen over time, that it wasn't just a plan in the end. And so it's also not only the dimension of your body, but it was also kind of the material of time, as well as the particularities of this particular place, but then how these lessons could be, that we need to think about them relative to other places. So the last thing, I just, and we talked about this idea of what happens to this stuff, right? It's now all polluted, right? What do you do with that? there's still many questions unanswered.
More questions and more.
More
as it
questions.
is.
We talked about how a strategy, an incremental strategy of a node and eventually creating a web, and finding that balance between what's fixed and what's adaptable. The fact that it moved into really thinking, and Matt, I would love to do a studio like that, I think that's great, that it comes down to architecture and public space and the communities that live there. And she didn't happen to mention, this building was designed so there could be pieces added in and programmed according to that community and needs, and scaled up and scaled down. We also talked about the UN Sustainability Development Goals. And the idea that when we build architecture and we do plans, that we're thinking of the process, both in how it impacts the economy of a place, the education of the people, like all those other pieces. And that's a whole other thing she could start to talk about. So I wanted to just say, if it's not obvious, that every conversation I had with Lauren, she was, oh yeah, I did that, okay, sure. Like it was always like, I'm on the next step. And I have to say, it's been, I can't remember the last time I started crying during a thesis presentation, but Lauren, tears really came to my eyes, both in terms of the possibility of starting to take on some of these issues, the meaningfulness of your project, and the power of what you've done. So thank you.
Guests in the conference room, the Dean's office, for lunch. We'll rearrange the venues for this afternoon. We'll be working